Section 11. The crisis deepens in the epoch of Gierek, 1970 through 1980. The system under Gierek remains the same as it was under Gomulka. Quote, although Gierek criticized Gomulka for creating the institution of narrow leadership, the same system remains in force under Gierek, despite his democracy acquired while living in the West. As under Gomulka, Politburo meetings at times resembled, as Gierek himself put it, silent parliament. We had to use school methods and ask our comrades by name what they thought about the issue being discussed at the Politburo, recalled the first secretary. Gierek had especially many complaints about Jaruzelski. After all, he was the only person in Poland who participated in meetings of the Politburo at the government presidium. No one in Poland, I repeat, no one, has such opportunities to correct all our mistakes. However, he preferred to wait. Having your own opinion under the system was harmful to your career. Society, even in the highest echelons of power, turned into a herd of sheep who preferred to silently follow their leader. This is beautifully illustrated at the beginning of the film Pilot and the Others, directed by Andrzej Wajda, 1971. As a result, Poland is increasingly lagging behind other countries of the world. Quote, at the end of the 1960s, the technological gap between socialist and capitalist countries was 25 years, and between Poland and the GDR, as well as Poland and Czechoslovakia, 10 years. Poland is trying to resort to foreign loans to build factories that will produce products for export, but export cannot be established for several reasons. Firstly, the licenses that Polish officials bought abroad were for products that were already outdated, such as the Polish Fiat. Secondly, the quality of the products produced under this management system was low. Considering that licenses and equipment were purchased abroad with foreign loans, the external debt crisis began to grow in Poland. Quote, the rapid growth of capital investment was made possible thanks to the use of external loans, which was the main reason for the increase in the country's excessive debt. In 1971, it amounted to $1.2 billion. In 73, $2.8 billion. In 75, $7.6 billion. Ruble loans also amounted to several billion. Being dependent on Western loans gave the opposition in Poland the opportunity to speak more than, for example, it was allowed in the USSR. Gierek tried to look as if political prisoners did not exist in Poland. Kuroń and Magdzielewski were released from prison early. The right-wing opposition, represented by the Catholic Church, also received concessions. For example, buildings that previously formally belonged to the state were transferred to the ownership of the Church. The West saw Poland's predisposition to restore capitalism and therefore freely issued loans to it. Kissinger, in a conversation with Slashchik, openly said that Poland should be a country that, by modernizing the economy and raising living standards, will influence other socialist countries, primarily the Soviet Union. Thus, the strategy of the West is to look for the weakest link in the chain of socialism in each given period and try through it to influence the entire system as a whole. In our time, Ukraine has become such a weakest link. It should be borne in mind that similar tactics can and should be followed in relation to Western countries. For example, in the United States, the most vulnerable issue has been and remains the issue of racism. If the Russian leadership really fought against the United States, it would certainly touch these chords. The crisis in Poland in the 1970s finds its expression in the increase in the money supply of the population in relation to consumer goods, and above all food. Quote, in a situation where the monetary income of the population increased faster than the growth of industrial and agricultural production, with stable food prices, disequilibrium in the consumer market grew. The demand for food products, primarily meat, increased. These difficulties were aggravated by the crop failure of 1974-75. Subsequently, Gierek recalled, everyone in the leadership of the party and state was afraid of the need for a new price increase. At the subconscious level, we tried to push such a decision back as far as possible. However, in mid-1976, it was already becoming inevitable. That means that the workers' protest movement was inevitable. The Soviet leadership was categorically against raising prices. Quote, Brezhnev told Gierek, don't forget about 1970. No further attempts to increase prices. This is not our advice. This is our position. The only thing left for you is to calm the situation. End of quote. According to Kostikov, Brezhnev threatened to reduce supplies of oil to Poland for several million tons if the Polish leadership does not listen to him. The result of this pressure was a compromise. In Poland, two categories of prices were established, state and commercial. For example, the highest grades of meat were sold at commercial prices in the individual stores, while little could be purchased at state prices. The commercial price for sugar was 150% of the state price. Sugar was sold using Russian cards at state prices. Under Gierek, the Polish leadership is seeking to join the World Monetary Fund, but the leadership in Moscow was opposed to this. Quote, General Pavlov, after establishing close contacts with Kania, Milevsky, Kichak, Kovalchik, and Yaroselsky, entangled Gierek in a veritable web of surveillance. As a result, everything that Gierek said in his office soon found its way onto Andropov's desk, and then became known to the rest of the senior Soviet leadership. Thanks to this, in 1979, the Kremlin blocked, for example, Polish intentions to become a member of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, to introduce the convertibility of the zloty. Kosygin explained to Yaroshevich that this contradicts the requirements arising from Poland's membership in the CMEA, that is Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, and the Warsaw Pact. In essence, such steps would lead to the inclusion of the Polish economy in the world capitalist economic system. End of quote. The behind the scenes struggle continued inside the government apparatus. Quote, a paradoxical situation arose when the Central Committee apparatus was actually in opposition to the government, trying to develop its own economic program and wage a hidden war with the government. In turn, the leadership of the Council of Ministers limited the flow of information to the Central Committee and also sharply criticized the reports and notes of the Economic Department's Central Committee and a group of advisors to the first secretary of the Central Committee. End of quote. At the end of the 1970s, there was a massive admission of new party members. Quote, the leadership of the PZPR set a course for a sharp increase in its number. The task was set to bring it to 4 million people by the 8th Congress, that is, by the beginning of 1980. There was a competition of the voivodeship party organizations as to who would accept more new members. Even high school students began to be accepted. In the Katowice voivodeship, they have something like a collective reception of minors into the PZPR. End of quote. In general, the PZPR deteriorated. Through membership in it, people increasingly sought to realize their narrow egotistic goals. Quote, under Gierek, the party state nomenclatura gradually became marred in the bourgeois way of life. They built duchies, luxurious holiday homes for themselves as a special privileged social group of society. Officials in mass traveled to the West at state expense, ostensibly to establish economic contacts. Control from above was weakened, which gave rise to the idea that one can do whatever one wants, a rise in careerism, nepotism, and demoralization, ultimately resulting in the disintegration of the nomenclatura itself. End of quote. In the film Man of Marble, we see how a director of the plant uses a helicopter to show his plan to a journalist. We see similar today in Russia and other republics of the former USSR. In the news we hear about accidents where senior representatives of the Russian nomenclatura die while hunting goats from helicopters in the mountains. Section 12. Forming of the opposition and a split inside the ruling party. The opposition, which was partially released from prison in order to look good in front of the West, began to gradually organize itself. A prominent role in this was played by the Committee for the Defense of the Workers' Corps, created in 1976. It helped the relatives of those whom the authorities imprisoned in connection with the protests. An example of this can be seen in the 1981 film Men of Iron, directed by Andrzej Wajda. Here we see how three representatives come to the pregnant wife of a jail activist and bring her money. Poland in the 20th century writes, quote, members of the Corps attended trials of workers, collected money for their families, informed the public about the harsh methods used by the security service against those arrested. Thus, they exerted constant pressure on the authorities. Names, addresses, and telephone numbers of members of the committee were quite widely known, and anyone could turn to them for help. In January 1977, almost 500 people received this kind of assistance. The total amount of funds by this time amounted to about 1.5 million zlotys. Financial support for CORE was provided by the old and new emigration, the Parisian magazine Culture, the Annex Group in London, and part of the Polish diaspora in the USA. It can be assumed that the CIA was also involved in this, as it later financed Solidarity. Core ideologists Kuron and Michnik promoted the view that real socialism in Poland is a totalitarian system imposed from the outside, crisis-provoking and unreformable. However, it can be changed through self-organization of society and constant pressure on the authorities. In the person of Kor, we see how the intelligentsia shook hands with the workers. We observed a similar alliance during the French Revolution, when the bourgeoisie gave its hand to the rebellious peasants and artisans in the struggle against royalty and the aristocracy. The union of two or more oppressed classes or strata in the struggle against the power that oppresses them is an important prerequisite for changing this power. In addition, the opposition intelligentsia continued to develop their own views using the Flying University Forum. Quote, in the fall of 1977, Flying University lectures began on modern history, literature, and history of ideas. The Association of Scientific Courses, created in January 1978, became the organizer and curator of this university. Historians Gierek, Diadlitsky, Kirsten, Russian philologist Drovich, publicist Mazowiecki, philosopher Amsterdam, biologist Kelianovsky, and others took part in the work of the partnership. In Declaration on the Program of Action, the partnership defined itself as an institution that supports the principles of political and ideological pluralism. It operated for about 3 years and contributed to the creation of an atmosphere of greater intellectual freedom at the University of Warsaw, the Polish Sociological Society, the Polish Historical Society, and the Polish Economic Society. Up to the autumn of 1978, members of the partnership gave 140 lectures in Warsaw, Krakow, Wrocław, Lodz, and Poznan. They were attended by about 5,000 participants, including 400 to 500 permanent ones. End of quote. These lectures brought the greatest benefit to the lecturers themselves because they contributed to the organization of their ideas. Today, the role of flying universities is played by opposition internet resources. For example, a Ukrainian opposition channel Strana UA makes a historical excursion about how 80 years ago Soviet troops stormed the Dnieper River in an attempt to liberate Kiev. Thus, they show how to bypass Russian defenses along the Dnieper in the Kherson region. The number of oppositionists in relation to the Polish government in 1970 was relatively small. Quote, according to Polish researchers, in the second half of the 1970s, 1,000 to 1,500 people were involved in opposition activities, including 300 to 500 people who showed constant activity. However, in the fall of 1978, the Ministry of Internal Affairs counted 3,500 such persons. This was not a very significant part of society. It is no coincidence that the State Security Service considered the opposition a marginal phenomenon in the life of Polish society, concentrated among the humanitarian intelligentsia and subordinate to Western anti-communist centers. However, thanks to Western media, primarily the American radio station Radio Free Europe, many Poles had information about the existence, activities, and views of opposition groups. The opposition in Poland was actively supported by capitalists from abroad. In 1978, Karl Joseph Wojtyla became the new pope. According to Wikipedia, quote, John Paul II became the first non-Italian pope elected in 455 years. Adrian VI, who became pope in 1523, was Dutch by birth, and the first pope of Slavic origin. The reason for this election was the desire of the ruling circles of imperialism to take Poland out of the socialist camp. Immediately after Wojtyła's election, the intelligence service of the first main directorate of the KGB, which was then headed by General Chebrikov, compiled a report for the country's leadership, which emphasized that three other Poles played the main role in the election of the Krakow Archbishop. President Carter's Assistant for National Security Zbigniew Brzezinski, Philadelphia Cardinal Król, and Primate of Poland Cardinal Wyszynski. John Paul II, with his subsequent visits to Poland, legitimized the opposition and, above all, the right-wing deviation in the person of the Catholic Church. The rapid growth of the authority of the Church as an ideological and political force opposing the communist regime began. In addition, the split deepened among the ruling party itself. Quote, in 1978-79, it became increasingly clear that Gierek's socio-economic strategy had failed. There was a lack of both consistency in the implementation of the economic experiment and internal unity in Gierek's team. Constant squabbles and struggles for influence among various groups and individuals continued. Yaroshevich, in a conversation with Korsakov, complained about the chaos that reigned in the leadership stratum, the lack of discipline and responsibility, and the interference of the party apparatus in economic affairs. Thus, the following were working against the Polish government. 1. The growing economic crisis caused by the Stalinist management system. 2. Growing opposition from the intelligentsia and workers. 3. Pressure from the capitalist West. 4. Intrigues and squabbles within the government itself. That is why Lenin characterized the pre-revolutionary situation as, quote, The lower classes do not want, and the upper classes cannot continue in the same way. In Poland, however, it was not a revolution that was being prepared, but a restoration of capitalism.